Good morning and welcome to Old Fort Niagara. I'm Robert Emerson. I'm the Executive Director of the Old Fort Niagara Association. This is the second in our series of distance learning programs. And today we are going to talk about the great Native American Council at Fort Niagara that took place in 1764. The character that we'll be visiting today is Guy Johnson. He is a deputy in the British Indian Department. He came from Ireland, and he was either a nephew or a more distant relative of the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the northern colonies. His uncle or relative was Sir William Johnson, and we're going to be talking about him as well. But first, a little background why there's this very, very large peace conference at Fort Niagara in 1764. Well, it goes back to the French and Indian War, which was fought between 1754 and 1760. Now, the French lost the war and they surrendered to the British. And with that surrender, they yielded all of their forts on the upper Great Lakes. So British garrisons now are marching into those former French posts and taking them over. Britain has a huge new empire to administer, a huge swath of land from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi. And it's once again peacetime, so the government is interested in cutting budgets. So you have these small garrisons that are scattered around the Great Lakes. Shortly after the British take over, the peace is concluded that ends the 7 Years' War. That happened in 1763. But things begin to go sour with the Native American population. And a couple of things that happen. First off, the British government has spent an enormous amount of money on the fighting the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as it's called here in North America. And they're interested in not going so far into debt, so they're going to be trying to cut expenses. And that means one of the things that gets cut is the traditional gifts to many of the Native American nations. The Native Americans had been used to dealing with the French, and now the sort of parsimonious policies trying to save money.
Can you now?
A lot of dissatisfaction. Other things that happen, the cost of trade goods upon which Native American people depend.
Hey, hang on.
Skyrockets.
This is a bust.
So other problems include poor relations with the British garrisons that have manned these Great Lakes posts. So by 1763, there's a lot of discontent in the Native American community. And there's a plot to capture British forts around the Great Lakes. In fact, 8 forts fall to Native American warriors in 1763. Fort Niagara does not. It holds out because it's a very strong post. But 8 other forts fell. One is abandoned. And there are a lot of raids on the frontiers, particularly of Pennsylvania and Virginia. So it's a very, very bad situation, and the British are not prepared for it militarily. Throughout 1763, the British have some setbacks. They're having a hard time mustering troops to address this problem. One of the forts that does hold out is Detroit. The natives, led by an Ottawa war chief named Pontiac, he coordinated a surprise attack on the post at Detroit. Fortunately, the British commander was forewarned and he was prepared, and so the surprise attack on Detroit did not succeed. But now the Native Americans are laying siege to Detroit. And Niagara is a critical post in trying to relieve Detroit and resupply the post, which is surrounded, and it's very difficult to get supplies or manpower in and out of that post. So Fort Niagara trying to resupply Fort Detroit. Probably the most infamous event that happens in 1763, at least here locally, is the ambush at Devil's Hole. Primarily Seneca decide that they're going to try to interrupt this supply line, and they ambush a convoy of wagons on September 13th, 1763. And they destroy that convoy, and they even wipe out a relief expedition that comes to the rescue. So this is one of the worst defeats that the British suffered during the war. They keep trying to relieve Detroit, though, and between native opposition and bad luck and poor weather, a lot of their efforts in 1763 are not very successful. So now comes 1764, and a bigger expedition is organized. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So about 1,200 soldiers under Colonel John Bradstreet are going to go through Niagara to relieve Detroit. But at the same time, Sir William Johnson is organizing a great peace council at Fort Niagara. Well, why Fort Niagara? Because of its location. It's located astride the waterways that link all these different areas around the Great Lakes. So over 1,700 Native Americans come to Fort Niagara in July and August of 1764 to take part in this peace council. Over the winter, the previous winter, William Johnson had sent out a message to all of these Native American nations. And his message is just loaded with metaphors. I think it's great, so I'm going to read it to you. His message said, "My friends and brothers, I am come with this belt from our great father, Sir William Johnson. He desired me to come to you as his ambassador and tell you that he is making a great feast at Fort Niagara, that his kettles are all ready and his fires lighted. He invites you to partake of the feast in common with your friends, the Six Nations, who have all made peace with the English. He advises you to seize this opportunity of doing the same, as you cannot otherwise fail of being destroyed. For the English are on the march with a great army, which will be joined by different nations of Indians." So that's the invitation that goes out all over the Great Lakes. 24 different Native American nations send representatives to this great council. As I said, over 1,700 attend. Now we're going to go and visit with Guy Johnson, and Guy is one of Sir William Johnson's deputies, and to him is going to fall a lot of logistical efforts. You have to present all of these delegates with presents. Gift giving was very important. If you did not solidify any negotiation with the bestowing of gifts, it probably showed that you weren't too sincere. So the British government had to purchase large quantities of gifts for the native delegates, and they were also going to try to get the fur trade reestablished as well. So let's go and visit with Guy Johnson and see what he is up to.
Certainly the largest list I've ever had to write. £25,000 has been spent on provisions alone. This will surely bring all the native nations to agree to peace. Since their uprising last year, none of them have even been able to trade. The governors would never agree to send a trader west if our native brothers continue to attack His Majesty's troops. is in the best interest of us all to have peace. We've certainly done our part to promote it. Sir Johnson has sent parties all over the country to call for a council. He has summoned as many native nations as he could reach. Mohawks, Tennessees, Wyandots, Hurons, Cayugas, Oneidas, Ottawas, Menominees, Ojibways. That isn't even all of them. There are hundreds already here, and more arrive every day. The journey to Niagara is no easy one, mind you. Some of our native brothers come from Western Lakes, Huron, and Michigan. They are traveling for days, weeks even, to come here to Niagara to talk peace. Who knows what enemies may present themselves to us in the future? Peace between our peoples will only strengthen us. Fighting between brothers only weakens our family, and we can little afford that.
So, the Great Indian Congress of 1764 took about 3 weeks during late July and early August of that year. Now, Sir William Johnson was very shrewd in that he did not want to make a general peace treaty with all of these nations, so he negotiated with them one at a time. The last thing he wanted was sort of a unified native movement. So he concluded different agreements with different nations that were attending. The Wyandots and the Senecas, who had actually declared war on the British, he established new treaties with them. Other nations, some did not take part in the fighting, but he renewed earlier treaties with those nations as well. So in particular, the Geneseo Senecas, who had taken part in the fighting, specifically at Devil's Hole and in other places, he got from them an agreement that ceded a 4-mile strip along the Niagara River to the Crown. Now, at the same time that the councils were taking place, the British had mobilized an expedition to relieve Detroit, and this was under Colonel John Bradstreet, as I mentioned before. Now, this expedition, about 1,200 men, they passed through Niagara. They stayed here while the council was in session. But that summer, they also fortified the Portage Road. They built redoubts or little forts every 600 to 1,000 yards along that Portage Road. They improved the ability to haul cargo up the Niagara Escarpment. They also built a new fort at a place called Fort Erie on the western shore, where Fort Erie, Ontario is now. So they were very, very busy trying to beef up the Niagara Portage. Bradstreet leaves here in early August, and by the end of August, he has arrived at Detroit. And on the way, he sort of exceeds his authority and concludes some separate peace agreements with some of the delegates that he meets along the way. And he was later criticized by the British commander-in-chief for doing that. But anyway, did this end the fighting? Well, it eventually did. There were still raids and sporadic killings along the frontier, even along the Niagara Portage. This continued, but it eventually petered out during 1764. So at this point, we've come to the part of our program where we will take questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and you can be recognized and let us know what question you have.
Okay, Lou Feeman has a question. One moment.
Go ahead. How many troops did the British have when the Americans were sieging Detroit?
The Native Americans.
Yeah. How many troops did the British have when they seized?
A couple hundred. Most of the troops, as I said, most of these frontier garrisons were pretty isolated. Detroit would have had a larger garrison than most of these outposts. A lot of the outposts that were smaller forts just had, say, a dozen men, but Detroit would have had a larger garrison, as would Niagara.
Cynthia Gallinger has a question.
Why did they want the fort so much? Why did they want Fort Erie so much?
Well, the whole idea was, before this, you had just a couple of forts along the Niagara. You had Fort Niagara, which was the big fort, and then you had Fort Schlosser above the falls. But you had the Niagara River was sort of the weak point in the whole transportation system. And supplies that were being moved around the Niagara Falls and along the Niagara River were vulnerable. So as part of this fort building campaign in the summer of 1764, they built these small forts called redoubts along the Portage Road itself. And then at the southern end of the river, on the western shore, they built Fort Erie to secure that end of the river. Also, they would keep a small garrison there. The idea was that if you ran into trouble, like the ambush at Devil's Hole happened the previous September, the idea was that you could retreat to one of these strongholds and not just be, out in the middle of the woods somewhere and vulnerable to attack. So I have another question here. How many people were killed in the war? Well, it's hard to say how many Native Americans were killed in the war, but we do have some fairly decent statistics for the Anglo-Americans. About 450 soldiers lost their lives during the so-called Pontiac's War. And it's estimated that about 2,000 civilians, these would be settlers along the frontiers, about 2,000 settlers were either killed or captured during the conflict. Another question, were there any famous Americans on this Bradstreet expedition? Well, I can think of one in particular that you might recognize. On the expedition, there came not only British Redcoats, there were two regiments of British Redcoats, the 17th and the 55th. British regiments were numbered. So those two regiments of Redcoats, but also there were provincial soldiers. These were men who had been recruited in the colonies, and they served their colonies, and they came from Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. Well, one of the officers who came from Connecticut was named Israel Putnam. And he went on to become a major general in the Continental Army about 11 years later when the American Revolution broke out. In fact, there's a county in New York named for him, Putnam County. It's just opposite West Point down along the Hudson River. So that's probably the most famous American who later participated in the Revolutionary War that came on the expedition.
You have a question?
No, I just wanted to tell you that, so since it happened in
We have another one from Cynthia Gallinger.
Hello.
How far did the war go back? Like, how many miles into the country did it come?
Well, hundreds. The New York frontier was preserved because of the Six Nations. Many of the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee people, sometimes called Iroquois, but the Six Nations who lived in New York, many of them were allied to the British. So the New York frontier was fairly well protected because of that. But going south into Pennsylvania and Virginia, and then going west, as far west as Michilimackinac, which is in northern Michigan, and on down Lake Michigan, to Fort St. Joseph. Those posts were all captured by the natives. So this war really took place over hundreds of miles of frontier. Okay, we got another question, and this is good. What were the Cradles? Some of you probably heard of the Cradles. They were, I mentioned them, but I didn't call them by name. One of the big barriers to moving supplies from Niagara to Detroit, or any place in the upper country, was the Niagara Portage. This was a road that bypassed Niagara Falls. It went from Lewiston to a place just above Niagara Falls, and you had to take all of your cargo, whether it's food supplies or ammunition or anything that you were moving west or east. But if you were going west, you had to climb up a 180-foot escarpment and then go across land and get back in the water above Niagara Falls. So that was a really, really difficult haul when you were carrying a couple hundred pounds of gear on your back. So the British devised an ingenious way to move cargo up that steep escarpment, and it was kind of like an early incline plane called the Cradles, and you could put cargo and gear on the Cradles, and it would be hauled up the escarpment by rope with a windlass. So it was a better way to move gear than trying to haul it on your back or haul it in a horse and cart. So that's what the Cradles were. Was Fort Niagara attacked during this war? The fort itself was not attacked. It was too strong. However, you took your life in your hands if you strayed very far from the fort into the woods. Like if you were a woodcutter and your job was to go out and cut firewood for the garrison, which you needed firewood even in the summer for cooking. So if you were a woodcutter and you were out in the woods chopping wood, you were vulnerable to attack, and some woodcutters did lose their lives as a result. The other people who were exposed were messengers. In 1763, 64, you didn't pull out your cell phone and call the commander of the next fort up the river. You had to actually send a physical message. And so messengers sometimes lost their lives while they were making their way from one fort to another. So no, the Fort Niagara was not attacked, but if you went outside the fort very far, you were in danger.
Marty Tabor?
Yeah, could you speak a little bit about the Battle of Bushy Run?
Battle of Bushy Run? Right. That took place in August of 1763. And Bushy Run is located east of Pittsburgh. And in 1763, as I said before, the British did not have a lot of success on the Great Lakes in 1763, but what they were trying to do in 1763 was to relieve two British posts that were under siege by native warriors. One was Detroit, which we've talked about before, but the other one was Fort Pitt at the forks of the Ohio River. Now, the expedition to Detroit was under the command of an officer named Dalyell, but the expedition to Fort Pitt was under the command of Henry Bouquet. And Bouquet was a Swiss, essentially a mercenary, but he was serving the British. He had fought in the French and Indian War in western Pennsylvania, so he knew the country. So he sets off from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, with a small army made up of Highlanders, Royal Americans, and some provincials. And they're making their way on, in Pennsylvania, you can't use waterways like you can in New York. So he's having to make his way over the Allegheny Mountains to Fort Pitt. And he gets as far as, it was kind of like a way station on the Forbes Road, the road that connected Carlisle to Pittsburgh, a way station called Bushy Run. And he gets there, and native warriors know he's coming, and so they've set an ambush for Bouquet. The Bouquet had learned a lot during the French and Indian War about wilderness combat. And this battle really took place over a 2-day period. Bouquet was stopped in his tracks by the native warriors. They pretty much surrounded him, and his troops sustained a lot of casualties. But the second day, he came up with a ruse that worked very well. He feigned a retreat on one side of the circle that his troops were arrayed in. He feigned a retreat. The warriors rushed into that space, and then immediately he launched a counterattack on their flanks and drove them away. So Bouquet was able to make it through to Fort Pitt, although his army was in pretty rough shape after the Battle of Bushy Run. But he did make it through. He did win the battle. He held the field after the battle was over. So Bushy Run, August 1763, it was a significant victory in the fact that his army was not annihilated, which so many other European armies were when they were trying to fight Native Americans in the wilderness. Let's see, another question. The invitation sent by Johnson mentions a belt. What kind of belt was he referring to? He said it, going back to earlier, he said, "I am come with this belt from our great father, Sir William Johnson." What he's referring to is a wampum belt. And this is a belt made out of beads, which are made from shells. And there's usually there are images on it that represent certain thoughts. A wampum belt was really important because it signified the authority of the message that the bearer was bringing. So if you invited a Native American delegation to a council and you didn't have a belt, you would not be taken seriously. So that's what they were referring to with the belt. All right. Where did the Native Americans stay while they were at the fort? Well, they didn't stay in the fort. That was unusual to have natives staying in the fort. It happened occasionally, with a few people, but over 1,700 Native Americans here. So they're going to be camping on the flat land outside the fort. Some may have been camped over on what's now the Canadian side of the river. But journals that were kept during this time mention these sprawling camps of huts, many of these huts made from natural materials. So they're going to be camped all around the fort. Keep in mind that forts generally had a cleared area around them to give the defenders a good field of fire in case of attack. So you're going to be seeing essentially a little city of huts while they're here. And it's July and August, so it's going to be warm weather, but that's where they're staying. All right, I think we're done today. Thank you for attending. We'll be posting this on our website a little later. And our next session will be on next Tuesday. We're going to be talking about, again, 1764 and what's going on here. but we're going to be doing it from the Native American perspective next Tuesday. So please come back and join us 10 a.m. Tuesday morning. And thank you for coming out today and watching.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so very kindly. Wonderful.
So long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a second.
That kind of stuff.